The woman clutched her shawl tighter as she descended into the cellar dwelling, the stench hitting her like a physical blow. Raw sewage seeped through the walls, mixing with the fetid water that pooled perpetually on the stone floor. In the corner, 3 children huddled on a pile of rags, the only bedding the family possessed. The youngest, barely 2 years old, coughed with a sound that rattled wetly in his chest. His mother knew that sound. She'd heard it in 4 other children before they'd gone cold in her arms. Outside, the sun shone on the great British Empire at the height of its power. But down here, in the shadows beneath London's gleaming facades, a different reality festered. This wasn't the Middle Ages. This was 1848, the modern Victorian era, a time of railways and telegraphs and unprecedented wealth. And yet, for millions of people like this family, existence was more brutal than anything their medieval ancestors had endured. Welcome to the true Victorian Britain. Not the romanticised world of Jane Austen drawing rooms and Charles Dickens's redemptive Christmas spirits, but the grim, unvarnished reality that most people actually lived. A world where the average working-class person might go months without bathing, where toilet paper was an unimaginable luxury, where children worked 14-hour days in conditions that would make modern safety inspectors weep. This is the story of how people survived when survival itself seemed impossible, when every breath carried the risk of disease, and when the simple act of drinking water could mean death. Before we descend further into this world, I want to invite you to join our community by subscribing to this channel. These historical narratives take tremendous research and effort to bring to life authentically, and your support helps us continue telling the stories that traditional history often overlooks. The lives of ordinary people struggling through extraordinary hardship. Now, let us step back in time together, into the smoke and shadows of Victorian Britain. The morning began before dawn for most working people in Victorian cities. There was no gentle awakening, no leisurely breakfast in bed. In the cramped rookeries and tenement buildings that housed the urban poor, entire families slept in single rooms, sometimes multiple families to a room. Privacy was a concept that belonged to another world entirely. Children, parents, grandparents, and often lodgers all shared the same space, the same straw mattress or pile of rags, the same thin blankets that did little to ward off the bone-deep cold of British winters. Consider Sarah Mitchell, a real woman whose testimony was recorded in Henry Mayhew's groundbreaking study of London's poor in the 1850s. She lived with her husband, 5 children, and her elderly mother in a room measuring approximately 12 feet by 10 feet. The ceiling was so low that her husband, a man of average height, could barely stand upright. The single window was broken, stuffed with rags to keep out the worst of the wind. In winter, ice formed on the inside of the walls. The family owned 1 pot for cooking, 3 bowls, 2 spoons, and no forks or knives. They ate with their hands or used pieces of broken pottery. Their water came from a communal pump 3 streets away, which functioned only during certain hours and was shared by over 200 people. The privy, a hole in the ground surrounded by rotting wood, was shared by 60 families. Bathing, in any sense that we would recognize, was virtually impossible for people like the Mitchells. The very infrastructure for cleanliness did not exist. There were no bathrooms in working-class housing. Indeed, the concept of the bathroom as a dedicated space for washing was still relatively new even in middle-class homes. For the poor, washing meant using cold water from the communal pump, carried in buckets back to one's dwelling, if one could afford to spare it for cleaning rather than drinking or cooking. Soap was expensive, a commodity that ate into the tiny budget that had to stretch to cover rent, bread, coal for heating, and perhaps a bit of bacon or cheese if the week's wages permitted. Most working-class Victorians washed only their hands, face, and perhaps feet, the visible parts that showed in public. Full body washing might occur once a month, if that. In winter, it might not happen for months at a time. The working poor wore the same clothes day after day, week after week. A typical working man might own 1 shirt, 1 pair of trousers, and a jacket or vest. A woman might have two dresses, one for work, one for Sunday, if she was fortunate enough to attend church. These garments were worn until they literally fell apart, then patched and repatched until no original fabric remained. The smell of unwashed bodies, unwashed clothing, and the general filth of urban life created an olfactory environment that would be unbearable to modern sensibilities. But the Victorians who lived in it had no choice but to become inured to the stench. It was the smell of poverty, and poverty was the natural condition for the vast majority of Britain's population during this era of unprecedented industrial wealth. And then there was the matter of human waste. Today, we take for granted the privacy and convenience of indoor plumbing, the simple dignity of a flush toilet and soft paper. These things did not exist for most Victorians. The water closet, an early form of the flush toilet, was a luxury found only in the homes of the wealthy, and even then, it was often unreliable, prone to blockages, and not widely adopted until later in the century. For the working classes, the privy or outhouse was the standard, and these facilities were nightmares of unsanitary horror. A typical privy in a working-class neighbourhood was a crude wooden structure built over a cesspit, essentially a hole in the ground where waste accumulated. These pits were supposed to be emptied regularly by night soil men, workers who came in the dark hours to shovel out the accumulated filth and cart it away. But regular emptying cost money, and landlords who owned the tenements were notoriously reluctant to spend on such necessities. Cesspits often overflowed, their contents seeping into the surrounding soil, contaminating wells and water pumps, creating breeding grounds for disease. Many tenements didn't even have separate privies. Instead, they featured necessaries, indoor buckets or pots that residents used and then emptied into communal cesspits or, in some cases, directly into the streets. The practice of throwing waste from windows, common in medieval times, had not entirely disappeared in Victorian slums. In the worst rookeries, human waste mixed with garbage, dead animals, and industrial runoff to create a toxic soup that ran through open gutters or simply pooled in courtyards and alleys. As for toilet paper, it was simply not part of working-class life. Newspaper, when available, and if one could read to appreciate its original purpose, was hoarded and cut into squares. More commonly, people used whatever was at hand: rags, leaves, straw, or nothing at all. The very concept of disposable paper for hygiene was alien to most Victorians. Even among the middle classes, who had begun to adopt some forms of toilet paper by mid-century, it was a luxury rather than a necessity. The poor made do with scraps of fabric that might be washed and reused, or they simply used their hands and hoped for access to water afterward. The lack of basic sanitation had profound effects on daily life and health. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and a host of other waterborne diseases swept through Victorian cities in waves of death. The Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames became so polluted that the smell forced Parliament to adjourn, was merely the most famous manifestation of a crisis that killed tens of thousands. People drank water, contaminated with their own waste, and wondered why the fever kept coming back, why children died in such terrifying numbers, why entire neighbourhoods could be decimated in a matter of weeks. The irony was bitter and cruel. Victorian Britain was the wealthiest, most powerful nation on earth. The Industrial Revolution had created fortunes beyond imagination. The British Empire spanned the globe. Railways connected cities with unprecedented speed. The Great Exhibition of 1851 showcased British technological and manufacturing supremacy to the world. And yet, in the shadow of this progress, people lived in conditions that made medieval peasants seem fortunate by comparison. For women, the conditions were particularly brutal. Menstruation was never discussed publicly, and the resources for managing it were desperately inadequate. Working-class women used rags, literal pieces of torn fabric, which they would wash and reuse when they could. But washing required water, soap, privacy, and time, none of which were readily available. Many women went to work in factories or as domestic servants while menstruating, with only these inadequate rags to protect them, living in constant fear of embarrassing leakage that could cost them their jobs. Childbirth, that most natural of human experiences, was a terrifying ordeal with an appalling mortality rate. Working-class women gave birth in their cramped, dirty dwellings, attended perhaps by a neighbour woman with some experience or, if they were fortunate, by a midwife. But medical understanding of hygiene and infection was still primitive. Doctors and midwives moved from patient to patient without washing their hands, spreading puerperal fever, childbed fever, with deadly efficiency. A woman might survive the birth itself only to die days later from infection, leaving her newborn to an uncertain fate. Children who survived infancy faced their own particular horrors. By the age of 5 or 6, most working-class children were contributing to family income in whatever way they could. Small children worked as crossing sweepers, cleaning horse manure from the streets so that ladies and gentlemen could cross without soiling their shoes, hoping for a coin or two. They worked as chimney sweeps, sent up narrow flues where their small bodies could fit, their skin scraped raw by the rough brick, their lungs filling with soot. They worked in factories, tending dangerous machines that had no safety guards, losing fingers, hands, sometimes their lives to the grinding gears and spinning belts. In the coal mines, children as young as 5 worked as trappers, sitting alone in the dark for 12 or 14 hours at a time, opening and closing ventilation doors as coal carts passed. Older children and women worked as hurriers, harnessed to coal carts like beasts of burden, crawling through tunnels too low for adults to stand, dragging loads that weighed more than they did. A government inquiry in 1842 revealed children working naked in the mines because of the heat, girls and boys alike, some as young as 6 years old. The testimony shocked middle-class Victorians who had no idea such conditions existed beneath their feet. The working day for adults was equally punishing. 14-hour days were common, and 16-hour days were not unusual in factories and mills. Work began at 5 or 6 in the morning and continued until 8 or 9 at night, 6 days a week. Sunday was theoretically a day of rest, but for many it was simply the day to do the household tasks that couldn't be done during the working week. Washing clothes, mending, shopping for food in the markets. Factory work was dangerous and monotonous in equal measure. Workers stood at their machines for the entire shift, the noise deafening, the air thick with cotton dust or chemical fumes depending on the industry. Accidents were common and often horrific. A moment's inattention could result in a hand caught in machinery, fingers severed, an arm mangled beyond saving. There was no workers' compensation, no workplace safety enforcement. An injured worker who could no longer work simply joined the ranks of the destitute, relying on the workhouse or private charity to avoid starvation. Speaking of starvation, the Victorian diet for the working poor was monotonous and nutritionally inadequate. Bread formed the bulk of most meals. Cheap, filling bread made from flour that was often adulterated with chalk, alum, or bone dust to make it whiter and seem of better quality. A working family might eat bread and dripping for breakfast, bread and a bit of cheese or bacon for dinner, and bread with tea for supper. Vegetables were expensive and often beyond reach. Meat was a rare luxury. Children suffered from rickets due to vitamin D deficiency, their legs bowing under their own weight. Scurvy, that disease of sailors on long voyages, also appeared in urban slums where fresh food was simply unavailable. The tea that was so central to working-class life was often adulterated too. Unscrupulous dealers mixed used tea leaves with fresh or sold tea made from dried and coloured ash leaves or other plants. Sugar, another staple, was similarly treated, mixed with sand or sawdust to increase volume. The Victorian poor were being slowly poisoned by the very food and drink they could afford, their bodies weakened by malnutrition, making them even more vulnerable to the diseases that stalked the slums. Water, the most basic necessity, was often the greatest danger. The Thames and other rivers were open sewers, yet people drew their drinking water from them. Even water from wells and pumps was frequently contaminated by nearby cesspits. The famous 1854 Broad Street cholera outbreak, which killed over 600 people in a matter of days, was eventually traced by Dr. John Snow to a single contaminated water pump. But it would be decades before the connection between water purity and disease was widely understood and acted upon. In the meantime, people died by the thousands from drinking water that looked clear and tasted fine, but was teeming with deadly bacteria. The housing crisis in Victorian cities was a disaster of staggering proportions. As people flooded from the countryside to find work in the new factories, cities like London, Manchester, Birmingham and Liverpool exploded in population. But housing construction couldn't keep pace, and what was built was often of the lowest possible quality, thrown up by speculative builders interested only in maximising profit. The result was street after street of back-to-back houses, dwellings that shared 3 walls with their neighbours, with no rear windows or doors, no through ventilation, no yard or outdoor space of any kind. Even worse were the rookeries, the notorious slum districts where the truly desperate clustered. These were medieval buildings that had been subdivided and subdivided again, with multiple families crammed into spaces designed for one. In some rookeries, landlords rented floor space by the night. People paid a few pence to sleep on the floor of a room already occupied by a dozen others. There were lodging houses where people paid to sleep sitting up, draped over a rope stretched across the room, because there wasn't floor space for them to lie down. The cellar dwellings were perhaps the worst of all. These were below-ground rooms, often flooded with water that seeped through the walls, never seeing direct sunlight, damp and mouldy and dark. Families lived in these cellars, sleeping on platforms of brick to keep above the water, their children growing up without fresh air or light. An 1842 report on Liverpool found that over 39,000 people, nearly a fifth of the city's population, lived in cellar dwellings. The mortality rate among cellar dwellers was double that of those who lived above ground. Crime was endemic in these conditions. Desperate poverty drove people to theft, prostitution, violence. The Victorian era saw the emergence of organised criminal gangs who controlled certain areas of cities, extracting protection money from shopkeepers and market traders. Child criminals were common, young pickpockets who worked in teams, trained by adult criminals who treated them with brutal cruelty. The novels of Charles Dickens, particularly Oliver Twist with its portrayal of Fagin's gang of child thieves, were not exaggerations. If anything, Dickens sanitized the reality for his middle-class readers. Prostitution was rampant, driven by economic necessity. Tens of thousands of women and girls sold their bodies to survive, working the streets, the music halls, the parks. Some were as young as 12 or 13. The going rate for a desperate streetwalker might be 6pence, enough for a meal and a night's lodging. These women faced violence, disease, social ostracism, and early death. The average life expectancy for a Victorian prostitute was estimated at around 22 years. Disease was the constant companion of poverty. Tuberculosis, known as consumption, was the great killer of the Victorian age, responsible for perhaps a third of all deaths. It thrived in the cramped, poorly ventilated conditions of working-class housing, spreading from person to person as they lived in close quarters, sharing beds, breathing the same air. The disease was slow and wasting, eating away at the lungs, causing the victim to literally cough up pieces of their own tissue, drowning in their own blood. There was no cure. The only treatment for those who could afford it was fresh air and good food, precisely what the poor could not access. Typhus, spread by body lice that thrived on unwashed clothing and bodies, was known as jail fever or ship fever because it raged in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of prisons and naval vessels. But it was equally at home in the slums, where people lived in conditions not unlike those in prisons. A typhus epidemic could sweep through a neighbourhood, killing indiscriminately, leaving survivors weak and often mentally impaired. Smallpox scarred and killed, particularly targeting children. Although vaccination had been developed by Edward Jenner in the late 18th century, uptake was slow, particularly among the poor who distrusted authority and had little access to medical care. Many working-class children bore the distinctive pockmarks of smallpox survival, their faces forever marked by the disease. And yet, despite all this suffering, people survived. They found ways to maintain their humanity, their dignity, their hope in the face of conditions that seem unbearable to modern eyes. Communities formed in the slums, networks of mutual support where neighbours helped each other through crisis. Women shared childcare and food when one family had even less than usual. Men formed friendly societies and early trade unions, pooling tiny amounts of money to provide for members who fell sick or injured. There was joy too, however constrained. Working people found entertainment where they could, in the music halls that sprang up in every city, offering song, dance, comedy, and drama for the price of a few pence. In the public houses where workers gathered to drink and socialize, to forget for a few hours the grinding poverty of their daily lives. In the street markets where vendors sang out their wares and people gathered not just to shop, but to see and be seen, to participate in the human community. Religious faith sustained many. Churches and chapels offered not just spiritual comfort, but practical assistance. Sunday schools that taught children to read, charitable societies that provided food or coal or clothing to the desperately poor. The temperance movement, though often mocked today, arose from genuine compassion for families destroyed by alcoholism, offering an alternative vision of working-class life built around self-improvement and mutual support rather than the numbing escape of drink. Slowly, painfully slowly, conditions began to improve in the latter half of the 19th century. The great sanitary reform movement, led by pioneering public health advocates like Edwin Chadwick, began to reshape cities. New sewer systems were built, though not without controversy. The cost was enormous, and many questioned whether it was worth spending such sums on infrastructure for the poor. Building regulations were introduced, setting minimum standards for light, ventilation, and space in working-class housing. Factory Acts limited working hours, first for children, then for women, and eventually for all workers. The germ theory of disease, which established that invisible microorganisms caused illness, revolutionized medical understanding and practice. Joseph Lister's introduction of antiseptic surgery in the 1860s dramatically reduced deaths from infection. The connection between contaminated water and disease became accepted, leading to the construction of clean water supplies and the treatment of sewage. Deaths from cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases began to decline. Education became increasingly available to working-class children. The 1870 Education Act mandated elementary education for all children, though full compulsory attendance wouldn't come until later. For the first time, the children of the poor had a chance to learn to read and write, to acquire skills beyond the manual labor their parents had performed. This was not pure altruism on the part of the ruling classes. An educated workforce was necessary for Britain to maintain its industrial and imperial dominance. But the effect was transformative nonetheless. Trade unions grew stronger, winning better wages and working conditions for their members through collective bargaining and, when necessary, strikes. The political franchise gradually expanded, giving working-class men, and eventually women, the vote, and with it, the power to elect representatives who would champion their interests. The liberal welfare reforms of the early 20th century would build on these Victorian foundations, creating the beginnings of a social safety net. But in the 1840s and 1850s, that future remained unimaginable to the woman descending into her cellar dwelling, to the child laboring in the mine, to the factory worker breathing in toxic dust with every breath. They lived day to day, hour to hour, focused on survival. They did not bathe because there was no way to bathe. They did not use toilet paper because it did not exist in their world. They did not eat nutritious food because they could not afford it. They did not live in decent housing because it was not available to them. They survived through sheer stubbornness, through an animal determination to keep breathing for one more day. They survived through the bonds of family and community, through small acts of kindness and solidarity that made unbearable conditions just barely endurable. They survived because the alternative was death, and the human spirit fights desperately against that final darkness. When we look back at Victorian Britain from our comfortable modern vantage point, it's tempting to see it as a different world entirely, to treat it as ancient history bearing no relation to our present. But these people lived less than 2 centuries ago. They were our great-great-grandparents, separated from us by only a handful of generations. The suffering they endured, the conditions they lived in, the battles they fought for basic dignity and decent living standards. These are the foundations on which our modern world is built. Every time we turn on a tap and clean water flows out. Every time we use a toilet and flush away waste without a second thought. Every time we step into a hot shower, we are benefiting from the struggles and suffering of Victorian workers who demanded better and reformers who fought for sanitary infrastructure. Every time we enjoy a weekend, we owe a debt to the trade unionists who fought for limited working hours. Every time a child goes to school instead of to work, we see the legacy of those who insisted that children deserved education and protection. The Victorian era was a time of extraordinary contrasts, immense wealth and abject poverty, tremendous scientific and technological progress alongside brutal living conditions, high-minded ideals of progress and civilization coexisting with the exploitation and dehumanization of millions. It was the best of times for some, and quite literally the worst of times for others. Understanding this complexity, refusing to romanticize or oversimplify, is essential to truly comprehending how we arrived at our modern world. The people who lived through those dark years of early Victorian Britain were not inherently stronger or more resilient than we are. They were simply people, with the same basic needs and desires as anyone in any era: to live in safety, to provide for their families, to find some measure of happiness and meaning in their lives. That they managed to do so under conditions that would break most of us speaks to the extraordinary adaptability and determination of the human spirit. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not as quaint historical curiosities, but as testament to real suffering, real struggle, and real triumph over adversity. The next time you enjoy the simple luxury of a hot shower or the convenience of modern sanitation, spare a thought for those who lived without such things, and remember that these conveniences are not ancient or inevitable, but hard-won victories of relatively recent history. The Victorian poor survived, and in surviving, they made our modern lives possible.